That was the last time anyone saw Pastor Elijah.
Have you ever heard of a funeral without a body? In a quiet village where nothing ever changed, Pastor Elijah was the soul of the town, a kind man, a trusted guide, a voice of peace. But one Sunday afternoon, after delivering his most haunting sermon yet, he vanished. No goodbye, no trace. 3 days later, the church bells rang, not for prayer, but for his funeral. No one saw him die, no one claimed the body, and yet the coffin was sealed. The congregation wept, and a note appeared saying he had passed peacefully. But the truth was buried deeper than the grave, because someone saw him walking near the river at dawn. Others heard his voice from the empty bell tower, and then the letters arrived. What secret was the pastor hiding? Why did he fake his death? And who in this village was willing to kill to keep the past buried? Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Past Portal, where every mystery finds its echo and every story leaves a shadow. We also send our heartfelt gratitude to everyone who's already supported us by liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing. Your presence keeps these stories alive. May peace guide your heart, may understanding open your mind, and may each step you take lead you closer to light, no matter how deep the darkness seems. Now, are you ready to uncover what really happened to Pastor Elijah? Let the story begin. The sky over the village of Halverton wore a cloak of thick gray clouds the day Pastor Elijah delivered what would become his final sermon. Rain tapped gently on the stained glass windows of the old stone chapel, echoing softly through the pews. The pastor stood at the pulpit, hands trembling slightly as he gripped his worn leather Bible. His voice, usually steady and comforting, quivered with a strange weight. He spoke not of joy or blessings, but of burden, silence, and the heavy price of secrets. The congregation, loyal and familiar, watched him closely. No one interrupted, no one dared. When he concluded, he stepped down slowly, walked past the altar, and gave an uncharacteristically long embrace to the choir director. Then, without a word, he exited into the drizzle outside, his coat trailing behind him like a shadow unwilling to let go. That was the last anyone saw of him. By the next morning, the town was alive with whispers. At the bakery, they spoke in half voices about the strange sermon. In the grocer's shop, eyes darted over shoulders as neighbors speculated. No one had seen Elijah return home. His modest cottage near the edge of the woods stood cold and undisturbed. The firewood stacked neatly, the door locked. His old bicycle leaned against the porch, untouched. The only thing out of place was a small envelope placed on the chapel's front steps, sealed with a wax imprint of a cross. Inside, just 2 lines. The shepherd has found rest. Prepare the farewell. That same evening, the church bell rang without anyone pulling its rope, and 3 days later, a funeral was announced. But no cause of death was given, no body was found, no one claimed responsibility, and yet the service was held. The coffin was closed. On the day of the funeral, a quiet fog blanketed Halverton, the pews filled with faces marked by confusion more than grief. Flowers were laid beside a casket none had seen opened. A young girl cried in her mother's lap, though no one knew if she understood why. The choir sang in whispers. A village elder read verses with a voice as hollow as the wind. Miriam, the church caretaker, stood in the back, her hands clenched tightly, her breath sharp and uneven. Something was wrong. She felt it in her chest. A farewell had been demanded by words, not by proof. And somehow, without ever seeing him dead, the people mourned Elijah as if he had never existed in the first place. It was as if the man had been erased, quietly, purposefully, and with a warning no one could yet understand.
The whispers that once trickled through Halverton became a steady current in the days that followed the funeral. Mothers spoke cautiously while sweeping their porches. Men lowered their voices while repairing fences and trading goods. Something felt unspoken, unfinished. Though the ceremony was done, the village could not forget that no one had seen the pastor's face in the coffin. The lid remained shut, as if guarding a secret buried not in death, but in silence. Even the grave diggers, 2 young brothers, admitted in hushed tones that the coffin was light, too light. But when questioned further, they denied saying anything at all. Fear had begun to stain their breath. It wasn't just grief that haunted the people of Halverton, it was doubt. Cold, creeping doubt that slithered between cracked floorboards and chimed with every bell toll. Miriam, who had been with the church since childhood, could not sleep. At night, the chapel seemed to whisper to her in the silence. A sound would echo, perhaps the shifting of wooden pews or the creak of the old confessional booth, always at the same hour, always just after midnight. One evening, unable to endure the gnawing tension, she returned to the chapel alone. The moment she opened the door, the air inside felt colder than outside, though no windows were broken. The altar candles, long extinguished, had been relit. Not fresh, not new, just flickering, weak flames that danced with a breathless rhythm. Her eyes scanned the sanctuary until they locked onto something lying on the pastor's chair, a single feather, charred black at the tip. She did not touch it. Instead, she stepped back and whispered his name. No one answered, but from somewhere in the tower above, the bell let out a soft clang, as if stirred by unseen hands. The next morning, the rumors exploded. Some swore they saw Elijah walking near the river at dawn, his coat drenched, his hat missing. Others claimed his voice echoed in the bell tower every Sunday at exactly the same moment he used to begin his sermons. Children spoke of seeing a figure near the woods who looked just like the pastor, but vanished when approached. It wasn't fear that spread, it was something deeper. A sense that the village had become the stage for something it couldn't understand. That Elijah's disappearance was not the end of a man, but the beginning of something forgotten. No one dared dig up the grave. No one questioned the sealed coffin publicly. But behind every closed door and every trembling whisper, the question bloomed like rot. If Elijah was not in the ground, then where had he gone?
The storm outside had passed, but inside Miriam's heart, a louder thunder had begun to roll. She returned to the chapel one afternoon under the pretense of dusting the windows and oiling the wooden benches, but her real intent was to search. Elijah's office had been left untouched since the day he vanished. She entered with trembling hands, the scent of old paper and pine oil thick in the air. His desk stood still, a silent witness to unfinished thoughts. She opened drawers slowly, carefully, until behind a stack of hymn sheets, she found a small tin box sealed with a braided ribbon. Inside, wrapped in aged linen, were 6 envelopes, each sealed with the same red wax cross from the funeral note. Each one bore a different name, hers among them. With a breath held too long, Miriam opened her letter. The words inside were written in Elijah's precise, steady handwriting. "You are not to carry this alone." She read the letter again and again, trying to extract meaning from every sentence. Elijah confessed to uncovering something long buried, a truth that had kept him awake for years. He had not wanted to vanish, he wrote, but felt that by remaining, he would place others in danger. The guilt was not his own, but he had held it like it was. There was mention of an old chapel in the forest, a map drawn with thin ink lines on the back of the letter. Miriam felt her hands tremble. She gathered the other letters and, with quiet urgency, visited the names one by one. Each person was someone trusted in the village: a farmer, a teacher, a banker, a widow, and a retired policeman. All were confused, all disturbed, and each had received a version of the same truth. Elijah had discovered a lie that had infected Halverton for over 30 years. As night fell, the six stood together in the caretaker's cottage, letters spread out on the table. The silence was heavy, as though the room itself held its breath. They pieced together fragments: names of the dead, references to a covered-up death, dates that no longer made sense. The retired policeman, Mr. Aldrin, turned pale when he read a sentence in his letter. "You buried it once, but it still breathes beneath the soil." The widow clutched her chest, whispering the name of her husband, who had died mysteriously decades ago. And then Miriam unfolded the map. It led not to a graveyard nor a field, but to a place long forgotten by most, the ruins of the sunken chapel beyond the ridge, swallowed by vines and time. The decision was quiet, but clear. They would go. The next morning, they would follow the path. They would seek what Elijah had left behind. The forest trail was half consumed by undergrowth, and silence ruled the path as the group of six moved deeper into the trees. The air grew cooler, denser, with every step, as if the woods knew they carried something unwelcome. When they reached the place marked on the map, they found what was once a holy structure, now bent and broken by time. The chapel was barely visible, its roof collapsed, its walls covered in thick moss and ivy. But beneath the crumbled altar, they discovered a rotting wooden door hidden beneath a slab of stone. With effort and hesitation, they lifted it open, revealing stairs that led into darkness. Lanterns in hand, they descended. The air was damp. The silence below felt heavier than the ground above. It was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of something buried but never dead. At the bottom, the lanterns cast long shadows on the walls of a narrow chamber. The room was small, but lived in. A cot lined with clean blankets sat against one wall, a crate of preserved food and jars of water stood nearby, an oil lamp still faintly warm. On the center table, worn but carefully arranged, lay a journal. Miriam picked it up and turned to the final entries. Elijah had been here. He had written of everything, of a murder committed 31 years ago by a man now praised as a pillar of Halverton. A young boy had died, his body hidden, and a lie had been built around the incident to protect reputations. Elijah had stumbled upon the truth through an old confessional tape and chose to remain silent for a time. But the weight had grown unbearable. He wrote, "When I uncovered what they buried, I could not stand in that pulpit and lie again. I left not to run, but to protect you from what would follow if I spoke." The group read in silence, each word hitting harder than the last. The map in their hands had not only led to a location, but to the fracture in their community's foundation. Mr. Aldrin, the retired policeman, muttered a name under his breath, the same man he had once sworn to protect. They realized the elder who was honored during the village's centennial celebration had been responsible for covering up the boy's death, and Elijah had known. He had confronted him quietly, only to be threatened with consequences that reached beyond the law. In his final pages, Elijah wrote one more chilling line: "If you find this place, I have likely stayed hidden, and if that is true, someone else is already watching you." The lanterns flickered. A breathless moment passed. Then, above their heads, a faint sound echoed down the staircase, one single footstep on the forest floor. They climbed the steps with frozen limbs, lanterns trembling in their hands. The forest above was hushed, still draped in the long shadows of dusk. But just beyond the chapel's ruined walls, they saw it, a fresh grave. The earth was dark and loose, the shovel still embedded in the dirt. No gravestone, no marker, only a wooden plank placed at the head. Miriam stepped closer, her heart clawing at her ribs. Written in familiar handwriting were the words, "Forgive me, for I could not carry the weight of the truth." Beneath that, a date carved softly into the wood, only 2 days old. The group stood in silence, each processing the same impossible conclusion. Someone had returned. Someone had buried this grave. And judging by the robes partially visible in the disturbed earth, someone had buried a body in the very garments Elijah wore during his last sermon. It was Mr. Aldrin who moved first, falling to his knees and brushing away the dirt with both hands. They dug carefully, reverently, until the face beneath the soil came into view. But it was not Pastor Elijah. It was someone else. Someone they all recognized. It was the village elder whose name was inscribed on the memorial stone in the square. The man celebrated for his generosity, his wisdom, his supposed grace. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful, but in his breast pocket was a folded piece of parchment, sealed with the red cross. Inside, a confession, written by his own hand. He had killed the boy in a drunken rage, silenced the truth, and enlisted Aldrin to bury the evidence in return for power and favor. When Elijah found out, he begged him to confess, but the elder had refused. Until now. Miriam turned to the others, her voice steady despite the tremor in her throat. Elijah buried him. He returned to finish what no one else dared. The evidence was clear. The pastor had not vanished from fear, but had acted to right a wrong too long left to fester. Yet he had disappeared again, without a trace. No footprints in the mud, no sign of where he went next. Only this grave, only this closure. And as they stood over the burial site, the wind moved through the trees like a whisper, carrying with it the faint scent of cedarwood and ash, Elijah's scent. Miriam closed her eyes and whispered a quiet thanks. Somewhere in the deep stillness of the forest, a bird cried out. Then silence returned. This time, it felt different. Not the silence of something hiding, but the silence of something complete. Weeks passed, and the air in Halverton slowly changed. The chapel remained locked, untouched since that final discovery. No sermons echoed from its walls, no hymns floated from the stained glass windows. Yet every Sunday, just before dawn, the bell rang once. Always once. Always at the same time Elijah used to begin his morning prayer. Villagers spoke of it in hushed awe, convinced that no human hand was behind the chime. Children began to place white stones at the chapel steps. Elders paused outside its doors, pressing their palms against the wood, not to enter, but to remember. The grave of the elder was left undisturbed. No monument, no ceremony, only the plank, slowly fading under sun and rain. The truth had come, not with judgment, but with silence. And in that silence, the village found the edge of peace. Miriam remained the caretaker. Though she no longer swept the pews or polished the candles, her role had changed. She became the keeper of Elijah's journal, hidden deep in a locked cabinet beneath the altar. She read it in fragments each week, finding new layers in his words that shifted with time. His thoughts weren't only confessions, they were reflections on faith, guilt, and redemption. He had not run from his post. He had walked willingly into exile, into the shadows, carrying the sins of others like they were his own. She often sat by the old river path, where others claimed to have seen him. She brought bread, she whispered verses, and sometimes she swore the birds stopped singing just long enough for her to hear footsteps nearby, soft and steady, never far behind. One evening, just as the sun disappeared beyond the hills, Miriam lit a candle in the chapel and left the door ajar. The flame flickered in the growing dark, casting golden light across the altar. And for the briefest moment, in the reflection of the glass near the bell rope, she saw him, just as outlined, the collar, the coat, the slight nod of his head. He did not speak, he did not stay, but his presence was undeniable. And in that moment, she understood. Elijah had not died. He had become something else, something between memory and spirit, walking the threshold between past and present. The bell rang once more above her, clear and full, as though announcing the end of a story no longer hidden. And when the sound faded, what remained was not sorrow, but stillness, a stillness that finally felt like home.
Sometimes the truth does not rise in the light. It moves quietly in the dark, waiting for someone brave enough to face it. Like Pastor Elijah, there are people around us who carry burdens, not for glory, but for the sake of peace. In our daily lives, we often walk past others without knowing the weight they hide behind their silence. We assume, we judge, and we forget that behind every closed door, there may be a story untold. This story reminds us that not all goodbyes are loud. Not all justice wears a badge, and not all heroes stand in the spotlight. Some disappear quietly, leaving only echoes of what they protected. In our world today, where truth is often blurred by noise, may we learn to listen deeper. May we learn to honor the unseen acts of courage. And may we find the strength to speak when silence is no longer kindness. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. If this tale moved you or made you reflect on something in your own life, we invite you to support us. Please like this video, share it with those you care about, and subscribe to Past Portal for more stories that echo beyond the page.